Chapter 10, Purina Pearce. Shortly after dark, Billy Jake Carver backed the minivan into the long, straight driveway at 155 B Pike outside of Olive Branch, Mississippi. With two revolvers tucked away under his blue coveralls that had police emblazoned on the back, he grabbed the ski mask and pistol grip sawed-off 12-gauge from the seat behind him. He had the ski mask on in a jiff and then slid out of the minivan. He quietly closed the door and waited for his two companions to exit the vehicle. He did not wait long. The passenger door slid shut and the team united under a shedding gum tree. Billy Jake Carver said, "Let's go," and they started their stealth walk along the sylvan property line that divided the Pearces from the Huffs. Billy Jake Carver was first. Derek Carpentier was second. Jenny Brock was third. Jenny started humming "In the Air Tonight," and the two men shushed her. They resumed their progress, and Billy Jake Carver felt an eerie sense of déjà vu, a mental state wherein a person experiences a sense of being somewhere before because he has played a video game that simulated the place he now visited. Billy Jake Carver stopped for a moment to let the strange feeling pass. Déjà vu could befuddle a person, and Billy Jake Carver recognized his confusion and tried to reorient himself. He studied the cars in front of him. Parked next to the house was a compact, an older SUV behind it, and a newer, larger, glitzier SUV parked in third position. The Pearces might have company, Billy Jake Carver reasoned. No problem. They came for Pearce and only Pearce. If one of the house guests decided to play hero, then there might be a problem. But otherwise, they would clip Pearce with surgical precision and exit before anyone figured out what happened. After a 15-second pause, Billy Jake Carver resumed the mission. As they arrived immediately behind the opulent SUV, he turned to Jenny and said, "This is your spot. If Pearce exits the front door, nail him. Everyone else is off limits." The ski mask that covered Jenny Brock's head nodded. Billy Jake Carver then proceeded up the property line. He turned and noticed that Derek had stayed behind with Jenny. With furious determination, Billy Jake Carver pounced on his subordinate. His giant left paw squeezed Derek's bony arm, and he pulled him alongside. "Don't turn chicken shit on me now, boy." Billy Jake Carver tugged his partner along, and he released his grip as they approached the backyard. The Rottweilers had detected lurkers, and they stood at the gate of the wooden fence and barked menacingly. From 30 feet away, Billy Jake Carver calmly asked Derek, "You remember the plan?" Derek paused and meekly answered, "Yes," with a dry throat. "Okay, let's go." And Billy Jake Carver led the way across the parking area that had given way to dirt and crabgrass and dandelions over the years. Billy Jake Carver peered through the opening between the gate and the fence. A large Roddy jumped up and snapped at his face, and Billy Jake Carver coolly moved his head back a few inches in a manner similar to Muhammad Ali gracefully slipping an opponent's punch. With the Rottweiler's teeth snapping just inches away from his nose and chin, Billy Jake Carver surveyed the area. There were 2 women and 2 men seated in lawn chairs and huddled around a bonfire stove. The bonfire was a portable wood stove that made for nights like this, a brisk Mississippi autumn evening where the temperature would drop into the 50s. The 4 cozies turned their attention away from the comforting fire to see what was bothering the Rottweiler. From across the yard, they would watch Billy Jake Carver spring into action, and they would try to make sense of the turmoil. He had carried the pistol gripped sawed-off 12-gauge in his right hand. Now he removed his silenced .38 revolver with his left hand and fired point blank into the wooden gate. The slug passed directly through the pine wood and landed deep in the chest of the upright Roddy in what would be a fatal blow. Billy Jake Carver would instantly learn that silencers did not effectively hush revolvers, and the four pyrophiles bounded from their lawn chairs. They hastily waddled across the patio and entered the Pearce house through the sliding glass door at the far side of the back wall. As they made their retreat, Billy Jake Carver used the revolver to raise the latch. He then kicked the gate, and it swung open about halfway where it met the prone and bleeding Rottweiler. Billy Jake Carver tried to sidestep the pool of dog blood. With his attention on his feet, he did not immediately see the other Roddy until she lunged at his throat. Billy Jake Carver used his left forearm to shield his vital regions, and his wrist would absorb the brunt of the attack. He thumped her hard on the head with the pistol grip, sawed-off 12-gauge, but each blow seemed to force the jaws tighter. The Roddy dislodged with a snapping descent of Billy Jake forearm coupled with a left knee that drove deep into the dog's midsection. Billy Jake Carver steadied his mangled arm enough to deliver a .38 into the canine's left flank. It yelped and dashed away to its doghouse, where it would bleed to death 4 hours later. Billy Jake Carver was once more shaken by the inefficiency of the attached silencer. He turned to face Derek, who stood frozen in the gateway. "Get in here, you wuss bag," Billy Jake Carver muttered. Derek immediately fell in beside him. Billy Jake Carver tried to stabilize his wounded arm enough to return the .38 to its holster, but he was unable to do so. He placed the pistol grip sawed-off 12-gauge under his left arm and then transferred the .38 to his right hand. With his good hand, he returned the .38 to the holster under his coveralls. He transferred the shotgun to his right hand and charged the patio with Derek right behind him. Billy Jake Carver tried to open the sliding door, but James Charles Pearce had locked it after everyone was safely inside. He shook the handle a few times, and remembering his strict orders to leave anyone not named James Charles Pearce unharmed, he yelled, "Hit the deck," to whomever might be standing on the other side of the glass. With that, Billy Jake Carver bent on one knee and emptied a shell into the door at an upturned angle. He would hear screams from Mr. Pearce and his wife, Amanda Lynn Pearce. The buckshot missed the Pearces, but they both received superficial wounds from the flying glass. Billy Jake Carver stuck a gloved hand through the splintered glass and unlocked the sliding door. He then forced it to slide on its track, and as he did, the remaining shards fell from the frame. Billy Jake Carver rushed into the house, where he saw a man and woman sprawled on the carpet of the family rec room. "Police!" he yelled at the top of his lungs. "I have a warrant for James Charles Pearce." Just then, the crack of a .30-06 rang from the driveway. Billy Jake Carver paused. The frightened man in front of him resembled James Charles Pearce. But if this was James Charles Pearce, who was Jenny shooting at? At her husband's chivalrous insistence, Tabitha Turnipseed had fled out the front door of the Pearce home. Due to her masculine build, her short hair, her husband's chivalry, and Jenny Brock's less than perfect eyesight, she was mistaken for a man. Jenny Brock thought that a man was fleeing the Pearce front door, and the man in question was probably James Charles Pearce. She fired one round from her rifle and it perforated Tabitha Turnipseed's trachea. From just inside the Pearce home, the Reverend Stanley Turnipseed watched his wife clutch her throat as he heard her gasp and wheeze. He was only a few feet from his wife of 26 years, but he was helpless. Whoever shot Tabitha was out there, and they would likely shoot him if he aided her. He would later wish that he had covered his wife's bleeding body, that he would take a bullet shielding his sweetheart and die a hero. Instead, the Reverend Stanley Turnipseed stood as motionless as a doe in a poacher's spotlight. After clutching her throat with both hands and desperately struggling to breathe, Tabitha Turnipseed fell down the 3 concrete steps and slammed her face into a flagstone pathway. She would eventually drown in her blood, but she would not go quickly. She would lift her head from the sidewalk and arch her back, and she would gag and spit and cough copious amounts of red fluid in a futile effort to respire. Hypnotized by his wife's final struggle, the Reverend Stanley Turnipseed would be jolted out of his trance by a series of 3 shotgun blasts emanating from where he and his wife had just fled. He paused for a moment, and then it occurred to him that quite possibly no one had called for assistance. No one had called an ambulance for his wife or had called the police to subdue the shooters. Yes, he would gallantly call emergency personnel, and he would save the day. The Reverend Stanley Turnipseed fetched the miniature cell from his right front pants pocket and dialed 911. 911, how may I help you? It was a nightmare come true. All his life, Stanley Turnipseed dreamt scenarios that were always different, but always the same. The situation always changed, but he would find himself in an emergency and he would try to scream, but he would be unable to do so. Now, as his wife struggled to breathe and shooters surrounded him, Stanley Turnipseed had gone mute. He would never again dream that nightmare, but his real-life silence would haunt him for the rest of his life. 11-year-old Purina Pearce had been cleaning her Mossberg 410 when the commotion started. Of the 4 bedrooms in the Pearce split-level home, only Purina's was downstairs. Most of the bottom floor was consumed by the rec room that exited to the patio that in turn gave way to a recessed bonfire pit. Purina's bedroom took up another 150 square feet. On this Thursday evening, Purina's parents were entertaining the Reverend Stanley Turnipseed and his wife, Tabitha. Purina did not like it when her parents entertained guests because it meant that the guests stole the spotlight that was meant for Purina. But she did like to sit quietly in her room and pretend to read as she eavesdropped on adult conversation. On her 11th birthday, which was just 1 month ago, Purina Pearce received her first firearm. It was a 3-shot Mossberg 410 shotgun, which she had nicknamed Molly. James Charles Pearce was not able to legally own weapons, so his wife, Amanda Lynn, took the lead to ensure that the family was armed and ready. About once a week, she took Purina to the firing range, and she forced her and Rhonda Renee and Charlene to watch firearms training videos and to play first-person shooter games. When Purina was not cleaning or assembling or playing with Molly, she took care of the family's 2 Rottweilers, Adam and Eve, or dazzled her little sisters with her broad spectrum of knowledge and charmed her parents with her girly cuteness. On Sundays and Wednesdays, she attended religious services at the Reverend Turnipseed's Olive Branch Church of Christ. It was a church attended only by law enforcement officers and their families. The Pearces were allowed to join the congregation because James Charles Pearce was considered a police consultant. When Purina was not attending to her family or her dogs or her church or her gun, she was playing Home Invaders Deluxe. She had dropped out of junior pageants and baton twirling and Girl Scouts after receiving her first version of Home Invaders. When the mother of her best friend, Melba Smith, forbade her daughter to play Home Invaders, Purina severed the relationship. In her eyes, it was inevitable. The Pearces were a police family, and police could not mingle with civilians. Besides, Melba was terrible at all shooter games. Over the past 3 years, the Jodie Foster look-alike fought hundreds of battles against home invaders in this very setting. In fact, the coordinates at her house at 155 B Pike was the only scenario she liked to play. Every cubic foot of house, every cubic foot of land, the Roddies with and without puppies, had been entered into the Home Invaders processor. She had been preparing for this moment for what seemed like all her life. Purina Pearce knew the score. Police impersonators were forcefully entering through the sliding glass door on the lower level. They had shot and probably wounded her 2 Rottweilers, and an outside shooter had hit Tabitha Turnipseed as she exited the front door, and now she gurgled and gasped and coughed out loud. Prepared listening. That was the phrase Home Invaders Deluxe used. Prepared listening. Unlike most video games, Home Invaders Deluxe could be played in the dark. Using advanced sense around, a non-player character pulled the house's circuit breaker and the players fought gun battles in darkness. In this setting, it was important to recognize the fragrance of gunpowder. It was imperative to recognize the report of pistols and rifles and shotguns based on sonic isolation, and it was crucial to interpret the howls of the wounded. Now, these unfortunate home invaders were trespassing on the turf of Purina Pearce. Conflict favored the prepared mind, and none was as prepared as Purina's. She loaded Molly with 3 shells and silently floated out of her bedroom, down the hallway to the entrance of the rec room, where a man in police coveralls and a ski mask pointed a weapon at her father, who lay with his head touching the base of the family's pool table. The most popular, as well as the most successful, offensive tactic in Home Invaders is police impersonation. The deluxe version introduced a tutorial for recognizing phony cops. Body language, posture, attire, techniques of entry, squad formation, verbal commands, verbal cues, the presence or absence of body armor. A typical video tutorial would include dozens of errors. What's wrong with this picture? Kinds of irregularities. Purina Pearce could usually identify at least 20 mistakes committed by bogus police. When in doubt, fire into the invader's torso. A police officer will wear enough body armor to resist the onslaught and will not be badly wounded. Purina Pearce remembered her training, and for a heartbeat she had decided to yell at the raider so that he would pivot in her direction and she would have a clean shot at his torso. But there was nothing legitimate about this amateur. Nothing at all. Purina Pearce acted accordingly. From a distance of 12 feet, she pumped a load of steel shot into Billy Jake Carver's left jaw. Fired from her low center of gravity, the impact spattered most of the gray matter into the ceiling tiles. The hit was lethal, and she knew it. No sense wasting a second shell on a dead man. Purina Pearce intended to follow up on the second intruder before he figured out that a counterattack had been launched. Upon firing the fatal shot on Billy Jake Carver, Purina Pearce performed a barrel roll without breaking stride. She arose on one knee and pointed Molly at the henchman standing in the doorway. The accomplice was a lanky figure who stood like a statue, clutching his weapon with both hands. Purina fired her second shot and hit Derek Carpentier in the midsection from 16 feet. The impact confirmed what she already knew. The invader was not a police officer. No body armor. No Kevlar wraps on the forearms. Just a bleeding, crying maniac who now jumped around and waved his hands like a game show contestant. Purina Pearce had planned on scampering past the flailing perpetrator to fire upon any invaders who might be lurking in the backyard. That would mean she would expel her last shell, and if there was a lurking assailant, she would have to reload quickly to fend him off. But then again, the surviving enemies might flee after all the shooting. Purina Pearce knew that her second target would need a little more help to shed his mortal coil, having absorbed a lot of steel with his hands, forearm, and with his weapon. But due to the fact that his hands and his weapon were damaged, he was not immediately threatening either. He could just wait patiently for his coup de grace. But as Purina Pearce tried to sprint past the shrill and bloody attacker, who pogoed wildly while flapping his scarlet hands, all the while chanting, "My God, my God, my God," he suddenly jumped into her path. A close-range blast into Derek Carpentier's solar plexus silenced him forever. Purina Pearce threw herself on the bricks of the patio. She scanned the backyard as her left hand scrambled for the 3 shells she had stuffed into the only pocket of her yellow dress. She dropped one of the shells, and glancing down, she saw that it landed in a pool of blood. She let it lay where it fell. She was able to load the other 2 shells into the molly as she scanned the backyard. There were no more backyard invaders. She savored her brief respite and considered her options. Purina Pearce considered grabbing some shells from her room. She also considered grabbing the sawed-off shotgun the invader had pointed at her father. But then something caught her eye. Adam, the loyal and loving companion she had known for over half of her life, lay on his side near the open gate. Thinking ceased as Purina Pearce raced across her backyard and threw herself on the ground next to her favorite dog's body. "Adam," she said as she gently shook his shoulder. "Adam, honey, Adam, honey." Her eyes filled with tears and she struggled to talk. In a few breaths, shock became rage and rage became focused anger. Adam, the fierce but loving protector of the Pearce household, was gone. There would be plenty of time to mourn his passing. For now, there was a score to settle. Oblivious to what dangers might lie beyond the pine fence, Purina Pearce raced through the open gate, across the family driveway, and jumped through the hedges into the Huffs' backyard. She crouched on the ground and allowed her eyes to refocus in the darkness. Prepared, listening. She could hear Mr. Huff's beagles baying from their pen. She heard the Gray's Mastiff bark from 800 feet away. But that was all she could hear. Everything else was strangely calm. Seeing no attackers in Mr. Huff's yard or anywhere near the Pearce family automobiles, Purina Pearce raced to find whoever had opened fire upon Tabitha Turnipseed. She dodged the Huff bird bath and tire swing and compost heap, and then she stopped suddenly. She was still in the Huff backyard as their house sat closer to the road than the Pearce house did. Had she crossed back onto her own property, she would have been in the driveway about 10 feet in front of her house. In the background, she could see Tabitha Turnipseed flopping about in agony at the base of the porch. In the foreground was the turnip seed SUV that had been customized with micro LCD lights that shone when the ignition was turned on and made the vehicle resemble a moving Christmas tree. Suddenly, she spied something she had not seen before. Resting on one knee was a small figure who wore the same ski mask and coveralls with police emblazoned on the back as the two invaders who had killed Adam. Purina Pearce pointed her weapon and studied her adversary. How had she overlooked this enemy who was but 20 feet away? Purina Pearce did not have long to study her adversary. The Reverend Stanley Turnipseed had regained his faculties and raced down the concrete steps with his cell to his lips. He was now screaming who's and what's and where's as he stood over his dying wife. He used live vid mode to inform emergency personnel of the details of his wife's bullet wound. Seconds after the Reverend Stanley Turnipseed exited the front door, the nearby sniper fired a round at him, missing her target altogether. She seemed to be sighting a second shot, and Purina Pearce reacted immediately. She charged the property line hedge, and from a distance of 10 feet, she clipped the sniper in a non-lethal strike that would damage several parts of Jenny Brock's brain. The sniper fired a second just as she was hit. This one also missed its mark. Upon impact, she launched herself in a spasmodic run that lasted several seconds. A less detail-oriented observer might say that Jenny Brock ran in circles on the Pearce front lawn. Purina Pearce, however, would later describe the dash more accurately as a lopsided figure eight. Jenny Brock would end her run where she started it, and she would stand very still for a moment as she stared directly at her nemesis. It was at that moment that Purina Pearce contemplated a direct sternum shot, but a voice inside her screamed, "No!" For the rest of her life, Purina Pearce was grateful for that command. Had she fired once more, Jenny Brock would not have delivered Derek's twin daughters 8 months later, and Purina Pearce would have held herself forever accountable for the fate of those unborn children. The shootout would make national news, but would make national news not just for the 3 dead people and the 2 dead dogs and the heroic little girl. No, the bigger story was that Billy Jake Carver had served time in Texas with members of the Mexican Alliance. It would be a testimonial to the Alliance's unbridled power. As thousands of the gang members were being rounded up, they sent a team of hitmen to Mississippi to blot out the super snitch. The Mexican Alliance could not be more brazen. For Purina Pearce, this would be an event that she would reflect on every day for the rest of her life. She would grieve the loss of her affectionate Rotties, but she would mostly look back with pride and a longing to relive the events. She would later learn the term peak experience, but until then she privately referred to it as her personal rapture. Purina Pearce had hoped for publicity and possibly endorsements from home invaders or the firearms or ammunition industry, but none would be forthcoming. Instead, the family would have their home sold, and they would instantly be whisked away to a gated community north of Memphis that was owned and operated by a mayor jail, specifically to house federal informants and their families. It seemed unfair to Purina that the Pearces had to abandon their house, but events would soon unfold that would make her see the wisdom of redeployment.